Good afternoon. We are pleased at Volunteering Victoria to bring you a special webinar with Dr. Blythe McLennan on spontaneous emergency volunteering. Blythe undertakes research and volunteering for emergencies, including spontaneous emergency volunteers, and we are incredibly lucky to have her expertise shared with us at Volunteering Victoria in the context of the current crisis nationwide. So welcome, Blythe.
Thanks, Sarah. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, so we'll kick in, and as Blythe is our only panel member today, you get her expertise the whole time. As we do with our webinars, I'd just love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of research to get us started.
Great. So I came to volunteering research in a little bit of a different approach from a lot of people that do it. I'm a qualitative human geographer. So that means I do research around how people interact with the environments that they live in, and environmental hazards and emergencies are a key topic in human geography. And I do research, and have done for about the last 10 years, on government and citizen or community interactions for disaster management and disaster risk reduction. And for the last 6 years of that, that interaction through volunteering.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's great. And so how did you get involved in this particular area of research? Was it just an area of interest or passion?
Yeah, it was a coming together of interest, opportunity, and a gap there that we saw that needed to be filled. When I first started getting into this area as a kind of around 2012, 2013, an interest in the emergency management sector, in volunteering outside of emergency service agencies, was sort of taking off. There wasn't a lot of research in Australia on that, and we thought it was a fascinating area. And there was an opportunity to apply for funding for new research projects with the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, which myself and colleagues did at RMIT. And I think we're the first project in Australia that specifically looked at volunteering around emergencies outside of emergency services. So it was really fascinating area and perfect time to be getting into that area of research.
Absolutely. Very, very timely and very timely currently. So, I guess to get us started, to give those who may be less familiar with the area than yourself, can you just give us a bit of an outline about what spontaneous emergency volunteering actually is to start off with?
Yes, for sure. So I'll kick off with a very formal definition first. So this is a bit of a busy slide. So just look at the white box at the top. This is a definition of a spontaneous volunteer from the International Organization for Standardization, who do all the ISOs for risk management. And so I thought this is there's lots of different sorts of definitions that are all pretty much similar, but a little bit different. But this is a good one because it's quite an international one. So that a spontaneous volunteer is an individual who's not affiliated with an existing incident response organisation or voluntary organisation, but who, without any extensive pre-planning, offers support to the response and recovery for an incident, so an emergency incident. They're often referred to by other names such as unaffiliated volunteers or often informal volunteers. That's the formal definition. I should, in the interest of being transparent, should say I don't like the term at all. I prefer the term emergent volunteering or emergent volunteerism, and I think some of the reasons why will become evident in a moment. But the term spontaneous volunteering, we've got it. So
it's recognised.
It's recognised. It's in common usage. So I do use it as well, but I think it's important just to be aware that when we do use that term, it comes with quite a lot of assumptions about what it is and what it entails, and a bit of baggage and imagery from media, media coverage of really large scale events, and not all spontaneous emergency volunteering happens on that scale. A lot of it doesn't. And there's some differences in how it's understood. It's quite interesting when I speak to people who've been involved on the ground with incidents. their understanding of what is and what isn't spontaneous volunteering. There can be some nuances around that. So there's a few kind of grey areas I just wanted to flag so that people are just aware that when they're thinking about it, to maybe check their own assumptions and their own understanding of what it is and the people around them, so you know what you're talking about and you're talking about the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, think a bit critically.
Yeah, that's right. So, so that's the grey box on the slide there, the second box underneath. One of the big differences in how people use the term can be, does it include people who are inside the community that's impacted by an emergency, or only people from outside? Often with the big events, we're talking about what in research we call convergence, with the people from outside the area that's been directly impacted coming into it to help. And that can be quite logistically difficult for the local community and responders. But there is also a lot of spontaneous volunteering and offers of help that come from within the community that's been impacted. So that's one nuance to it. Another one is the difference between helping and volunteering. So a lot of people who we would categorise as spontaneous volunteers don't identify as being a volunteer, they are helping. They don't necessarily think of themselves as a volunteer. A lot of people who are spontaneous volunteers, some studies have shown that there's a lot of first timers that are not regular volunteers, and so they might not associate with that language very well. We often think of spontaneous volunteers as individuals who just kind of rock up or step up individually.
Up to an event, yeah.
But actually there's a lot of groups, so corporate groups, employee groups, volunteer, so community organisations who already have volunteers but nothing to do with emergency management or disasters, who will come and offer help as a group. So that's another distinction. The idea of a volunteer is quite culturally specific as well. So it
can be, absolutely.
Yeah, it's quite a white middle class term. And if you look at like Bureau of Statistics figures on volunteering, they can show that in households where English isn't the first language, will show lower rates of volunteering. But often what you find is it doesn't classify as volunteering, might not be in a formal organisation, but there can be really strong cultural norms about social obligation and social responsibility and helping others that don't fall within that kind of
formal context.
That's right, yeah. So that idea of volunteering can be quite culturally specific, so we need to be wary of that.
And worth, I guess, just interjecting here, like some of these distinctions and nuances apply to spontaneous emergency volunteers, but apply right across the board as well.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really great for Blythe to highlight this, but so many of them go back to, volunteerism in general.
It's the nature of volunteering and helping and community service. Yeah.
And self-identification.
Yeah.
And, this is why we have webinars, to discuss some of this nuance. So I'll let Blythe keep going.
Yeah, I could speak for now just on this one slide, which I won't, just looking at Sarah, I promise. But so I'll just briefly go through the last points there. The idea, this is one that really interests me, of what is being affiliated or unaffiliated with spontaneous volunteers. People often think of them as not being affiliated with emergency response or a formal organisation. What we find is they can be temporarily affiliated, and some researchers refer to that as borrowing legitimacy. So, and we'll talk a little bit about models for sort of coordinating spontaneous volunteers later, but they can become temporarily affiliated with an organisation, and then they're not really unaffiliated. Or they might be affiliated with a volunteer-based organisation, but not one that has trained them for emergency response conditions. So that idea of what is affiliated and not is also quite interesting. They're often assumed to be disorganised, and this is where my preference for emergent volunteering comes in, because post-disaster we know, and there's long tradition of sociological research on this, that there are emergent groups and emergent organisation and emergent leaders that step up post-disaster, and that groups that are not in a formal organisation can be organised, they can be self-organised, and spontaneous volunteers are often associated with emergent groups. So they're not necessarily, can be disorganised, but are not necessarily disorganised.
But it's not a trait right across the board.
It isn't, no. And I think some of the imagery about spontaneous emergency volunteers is just mass numbers of people rocking up with no degree of organisation, but that's often not the case. Yeah. Self-deployed trained responders is an interesting one. So apparently there's quite high levels of people who are trained for emergency context. If their organisation is not responding to that event, they can self-deploy, but they are trained, but they're not deploying through their organisation that they're trained with. So it could be, say, bushfire volunteers under their own auspices travelling to another area to help out, etc. So that's quite prevalent. And now more and more we have people who are so-called spontaneously volunteering, but they repeatedly do it. So Blaze Aid has volunteers who would fall within the definition of spontaneous volunteers, but they'll go and volunteer for Blaze Aid at different camps for different events. So it's not really unplanned or spontaneous. If they're doing it repeatedly, they're more like an episodic volunteer.
But an episodic volunteer in a very specific circumstance,
That's
which
right.
classes them as a spontaneous. I see your preference for emergent volunteer here, but we'll push on. I think, next I'm curious to know, there is a history of major incidences that have had spontaneous emergency volunteer responses. And I guess I'm interested to know what some of the trends are kind of moving forward, what we've seen in major incidences.
Okay. Yeah, so there's just talk about experiences in Australia, because I'll speak to international context in a little bit later. So one thing to know is that what we now call spontaneous emergency volunteering is historically prevalent. It's always happened with big emergency events. We haven't called it spontaneous volunteering before. It's been studied since the 1950s in disaster sociology under different names of convergence, being people and things converging on a disaster site to help from outside, and emergence, which I've already talked about. So emergent behaviour, groups and leadership, but it wasn't called volunteering.
And I think it's worth, again, putting this in context of the high degree of formalisation that's happened in the sector. So, involving volunteers in your organisation for a number of reasons has become more formalised.
That's right.
Given some of the child safety and general safety measures that organisations have to ensure. So it is definitely an area of study that exists in a different way than it did in the 1950s.
That's right, yeah. And it has fallen outside the scope of what is formal volunteering, and so it's not been studied as a form of volunteering in the past. So the label of spontaneous emergency volunteer came about mostly following 9/11 and the World Trade Center attacks. There was, I think it's somewhere different estimates, between 30 to 60,000 volunteers came to Ground Zero, some with formal organisations, some self-organised groups, and study of that event has led to the use of the term spontaneous emergency volunteering. But it was, the history of it occurring is as long as humanity, basically. But some high visibility examples from Australia, I've listed a few there. The Christchurch earthquakes were big for Australian thinking around spontaneous emergency volunteering, and particularly this experience of the student army. If you want to know more about that, there's some great papers and information online, but was a youth response to help with the cleanup following Christchurch earthquake. Brisbane Mud Army was big in the media in Australia, and that was a mix of people just helping each other informally, so neighbours and family, people informally volunteering and rocking up to depots to help with cleanup, and some people who were matched by Volunteering Queensland to help organisations to help. So there's a mix there. Tassie Fires We Can Help was a group that started up on Facebook in response to the Denali fires in Tasmania in 2013. And that was an interesting case because it was coordinated by Mel Irons through a Facebook group that involved virtual digital volunteering and on the ground volunteers around Tasmania responding to that fire.
And again, technology has been such a game changer in terms of this space, imagine.
Absolutely. So that, if you're talking about trends, that would be one of the biggest ones. So it's always happened, but social media, and there's a point a little bit further down about that, but I'll speak to that now, has had a really big impact. It's brought more attention to spontaneous volunteering for starters. It always happened, but we didn't kind of see it and know about it so much. It's also meant that more people have seen emergencies unfold in almost real time. So we call that like vicarious exposure to it. So motivation to help can come, you don't have to be on the site to be motivated to help. You can be motivated to help from further away because you're seeing it unfold in front of you on social media. And also another really big impact of social media is our capacity to organise ourselves using social media without needing to go through a formal organisation has now increased. And there's a lot of, so the Tassie Fires We Can Help example is a great example of that, where informal volunteers and spontaneous volunteers and emergent groups can organise themselves using social media, Facebook groups, etc. And so it's a lot of researchers talk about how it has lowered the barriers of participation for people to participate in responding to emergencies.
Absolutely. And, you know, for anyone who's been on social media in the past month, I'm sure none of what Blythe is highlighting is a huge surprise in terms of both that, you know, vicarious exposure and seeing, you know, the emergency take place almost in front of your eyes, but also that ability to click a button and donate, or click a button and send goods, or whatever it is. The participation barriers are absolutely lowered.
Yeah, so that's been a really big trend. As far as other sort of trends, a lot of people talk about spontaneous emergency volunteering, so that it is increasing in kind of quantity and frequency. Some people suggest that maybe that's not the case, that it's just more visible now through social media, and we don't really have really rigorous data studies to kind of say one way or the other. I think it's certainly changed in form, and through social media might encourage more people who are not at the actual impacted site physically to participate. So it may have increased, but a lot of, we do hear a lot that, oh, it's increased, thrown about. It's always been there. It might have increased a bit, but perhaps not as much as we think. Yep. And then I guess another key trend is interest in, from the formal side of emergency response, in acknowledging that spontaneous volunteering happens, that it's normal, and thinking about how do we coordinate this activity or link it with the formal response that is growing. And we've got different events or different responses to that kind of developing now. So that's been a trend too.
Wonderful.
And then I guess speaking to the final point on there that I haven't touched on yet, another trend is a growing recognition of the importance of spontaneous emergency volunteering as being part of what we call a therapeutic community. And that is for the communities who have been impacted and volunteers. So there's really good and quite extensive amount of research that shows the benefits to people impacted of having community and citizens rally around them, but also for volunteers, even if we're not in the direct path of an emergency and we're not directly impacted ourselves, more widely, especially now that we're more exposed to emergencies through social media, we're all impacted, especially like this season. We're all processing that psychologically ourselves and socially as a society, processing the impacts of that kind of season ourselves. And spontaneous emergency volunteering can be a part of people processing that, and it's a therapeutic function both for the volunteers as well as for the communities that are being assisted.
Absolutely. And I think that is really important to highlight, that, you know, healing power coming together as a community, both for those impacted and for those volunteering.
That's right.
So that's great. And I guess I'm curious to know why spontaneous, and you know, you kind of highlighted a little bit, but why spontaneous emergency volunteering has been a little bit separate research-wise from more traditional formal, you know, types of volunteering.
So I think that comes back to that it doesn't sort of fall within the scope of what we think of as formal, kind of mainstream, in inverted commas, volunteering. It's short term, tends to be more informal or quite informal. And so it's not managed in the same way that formal volunteering is managed within formal organisations. And so it's been studied mostly from a sociological sort of perspective, and also because it's specific to emergency context, has been studied by researchers who focus their research on disasters, emergencies, etc. And then the study of volunteering, the mainstream kind of study of volunteering has been that more traditional classic volunteering that's in formal organisations. Those streams are coming together more and more now, which is really positive, because they there's some cross-learning in both directions that is really positive, and quite interesting that's happening now. Yeah.
No, it's wonderful. And so just, you know, I guess to really solidify it in everyone's head, the main differences between spontaneous emergency volunteering and traditional volunteering, and up on the screen, but
Yep.
It would be great if you could talk us through.
Yeah, so that's my little thrown together table of sort of comparing spontaneous emergency volunteers, who I think of as traditional classic style volunteers. One area people talk about a lot is motivation. So with traditional classic volunteering, we know there's various motivations, but the primary core motivation is altruistic, so helping others in the community. With spontaneous emergency volunteers, that's the same, but there tends to be more of a mixed motivations behind that as well. So that therapeutic benefits that we've already talked about is one part of the motivation. Also found, because it's short-term and event-focused, availability. So if you feel that you are available, either that you can physically get to a location, or you can get leave from work, or you're on holidays from university, etc. So you physically have availability. That's a key part of motivation. And if you feel that you have capacity, so you have some kind of skill that you that you feel could be useful. And another really important aspect is either having relationships to the people or to the place. So we know in the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, a lot of four-wheel drive clubs were quite active in volunteering after the event, because the fires were impacting areas where they spent a lot of time recreationally, and they felt a real connection to those communities and to those places. And so there was a high level of volunteering from those clubs because of that connection. So those different kinds of connections we can have to people and place reinforce spontaneous volunteering.
How interesting.
Yeah.
But it makes total sense when you think about the network and how people just operate.
That's right.
That motivation for sure.
Yeah. As far as participation, spontaneous emergency volunteers, categorically, it can be anyone. It varies from specific event to event of who participates in it. It can be quite opportunistic about where it is and who lives nearby and who's on leave, and if it happens in university holidays, it's different from happening mid university semester.
Everybody's assignment.
That's right, exactly. So that's more of an issue with spontaneous emergency volunteering. With traditional classic volunteering, we understand there's certain categories or demographics that tend to have high rates of volunteering. I've listed a few there. Duration, of course, is a big difference. So spontaneous emergency volunteering, more short term, it's project based. So you go there to meet a need. When the need's met, then you stop your volunteering, and tends to be more irregular compared to more traditional volunteering. Spontaneous emergency volunteers, a big difference is they're not trained by an organisation for the volunteer work that they're doing specifically. So it might be unskilled volunteering they're doing, or they might be skilled and bringing skills to the volunteering, but it's not skills that they have been trained for in that specific context. So I know, for example, in Queensland, they have people with chainsaw certificates requested and went and spontaneous volunteered to help with cleanup, but they had kind of the right licenses and training with chainsaws and worked with teams with councils to help with cleanup. So that's a skilled
Absolutely.
example.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then affiliation, they're not affiliated, or they're only temporarily affiliated with an organisation. And another difference, I think, is their legitimacy. So in emergencies, there can be a bit, they're not really legitimate players in the space, they're not affiliated, they're going to be a problem. There are, which we'll talk about, some risks and challenges and logistics around particularly big examples of spontaneous emergency volunteering, but the acceptance of them as legitimate responders and legitimate players has tended to be more mixed, whereas with traditional classic volunteers, it's very legitimate, accepted, you're affiliated, you're insured, you're part of the scene. Legitimacy isn't queried as much.
Absolutely. And again, I think a really important point to highlight. So now I guess moving internationally, can you tell us a little bit about some examples where spontaneous emergency volunteering was a big part of the emergency response and what lessons maybe were learnt internationally?
Okay. There are a lot of international examples, and I've taken a bit of information from one paper in particular that's listed in the resources at the end of the presentation. That is by Twigg and colleagues, that give a really good summary internationally of incidences of spontaneous emergency volunteering. A lot of the international experience that's been really visible and researched has been around earthquake, because earthquakes are so sudden that they're hard to prepare people for, and they're large scale, so hard to respond to, and also because there's so much building and infrastructure damage, it's hard for trained responders to move about to the places where responders are needed. So we see a lot of spontaneous emergency volunteering around large earthquake events. So I've got 3 images there on the slide. The first one is from the Mexico earthquake in Mexico City in 1985. Well, that image is of a group that came into being because of that earthquake, because there was a huge response. Most of the people rescued from buildings who were trapped in that earthquake were rescued by local people, and it was like direct citizen action because of the scale of it. Getting trained search and rescue teams in everywhere was just impossible. Yeah. So there was a group that later formed into a not-for-profit search and rescue team that now works globally, called, and I'm going to pronounce it really badly, where's my Tlatelolco, but it was a group of youth in Mexico City that went in and did a lot of search and rescue and saved a lot of people. But there's estimates that about 10% of the population of Mexico City volunteered around that event.
That's an incredible figure.
For Mexico City, it's about 2 million people. So It's massive. Some other big examples that we've learned a lot from: Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995. They estimates vary, about 630 to 1.4 million people helped with a response to that. And it's often cited as that experience of that citizen response to that event helped to reinvigorate civic action in Japan, which didn't have prior to that extremely high rates of volunteering, that it actually impacted the culture of volunteering in that country afterwards, which is quite fascinating.
Again, we'll, potentially return to, but I think it's important to think about how, the relationship between formal volunteering, traditional volunteering, and spontaneous emergency volunteering, and capitalising on those feelings of kind of community connectedness.
That's right. And there are some studies that do show that quite a high proportion of spontaneous volunteers go on to either formally volunteer or become more engaged in civic engagement, in community service post that experience. Yeah, so and I think Kobe is a really good example of that. Similar examples from other large events with huge numbers of people, in the 9/11 attacks and the World Trade Center, Ground Zero in New York City, as I said, different estimates, 30 to 40 to 60,000 people kind of converged on there with a volunteer response. And while those sorts of numbers can sound daunting to people, it isn't always that large scale. So I'm just thinking of volunteer managers sitting back in a community sector organisation going, oh my goodness, how on earth could I possibly deal?
My database system does not know how to cope with
we have one phone line. What on earth it's not always of that scale. They're just the really large high visibility events. So of the 3 images there, I'm in the middle, of course, referencing the 9/11 and World Trade Center attacks. And the third one is interesting, and the research is still coming out from that, which is the has been termed the refugee crisis in Europe from 2015. And there was a massive spontaneous volunteer response to that. There's a different kind, and there's studies being done now and research starting to come out on how they formed and worked with the more formal organisations in assisting refugees, which is quite a different example, but there's a lot of learning just beginning to come out from that as well.
Well, and I imagine quite interesting from a cultural perspective in that it was, you know, occurring across a wide geographical area, across, you know, a time span that was different. So your experience in Lesbos as opposed to Calais might be
That's right,
completely different. So
yeah.
We'll hit you up to come back and talk through that research once it's all come out. And
yeah, fascinating example, because it's quite different contexts and potentially motivations, and a lot of people travelling from other places to come in, and then cultural aspects, and yeah, really fascinating.
Even different geography. I imagine the human geographer and you,
yes.
terrain can make a difference.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. So that, I think, gives us a really great understanding of the context. And, you know, again, you guys can probably go back and have a look at, search for the community response yourself if you're interested, particularly in the response in Kobe or the refugee crisis, etc. But we'll, I guess, bring it back home and I guess ask about the scope of your particular research in the Australian context.
Yeah, so our research was in the context of looking at volunteering that isn't directly coordinated by emergency services, so as in response volunteers of the Bushfire Brigade volunteers, SES volunteers, etc. And we got into that at a time when spontaneous volunteering sort of hit the radar of the emergency management sector. And so often people would equate our research just with spontaneous emergency volunteering, which I found interesting as well, because there's a whole spectrum of volunteering that supports communities before, during and after emergencies happen. A lot of it's in the community sector organisations. But specifically with the spontaneous emergency volunteering, so we were most interested in how it interacted with or didn't interact with the formal side of the emergency management response. And so we did some work with stakeholders of looking at benefits and risks of different approaches to spontaneous emergency volunteers from a kind of formal organisational perspective. And some of that research underpins the AIDA, so Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience handbook on spontaneous volunteering, which is called, it's up there on the screen, Communities Responding to Disasters, Planning for Spontaneous Volunteers. So I was involved in parts of that handbook, and we called it Planning for Spontaneous Volunteers on purpose, because not everybody is going to manage them. Everyone talks about managing spontaneous volunteers. Some spontaneous volunteering will not be managed by a formal organisation. It is emergent, it is helping. They're not necessarily people that identified being a volunteer who are going to be formally managed through an organisation. So, and then even organisations that say this is not for us, we're not going to manage spontaneous volunteering. There's still some planning and thinking about it and about communicating, etc. And so we did some work around the different strategies or approaches to spontaneous volunteers and the different benefits, risks, limitations of different approaches. And then we also did a case study on EV Crew, which is a system developed by Volunteering Queensland to link spontaneous volunteers and offers of assistance from the general public with organisations that are helping communities when emergencies happen.
Absolutely, and I think it's again a really good point to say that not everyone necessarily will manage a spontaneous emergency volunteers, but the toolkit from AIDA and a lot of the information on the Volunteering Queensland website, you know, gives you the tools and the questions to think about how you channel that effort or don't channel, or how you respond to that, because you know, in this context, spontaneous volunteers do appear, so it's important to think a little bit ahead of time about how you will involve or not involve yourself with them. That's right, as an organisation.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I guess that leads us actually quite nicely into initiatives in Australia that have been set up to mobilise and deal with effort. So, you know.
Yeah, so in Australia, there's been a lot happening in the time since we first started getting involved in the research. So since about 2012, 2013, there's been heaps happening in Australia. Again, just to make clear, and there's this quote again from that same article I was referring to earlier with the quote by Twigg and colleagues, a quote that I like to keep in front and centre is that formalisation can complement emergent activity, but it does not replace it. And I say that because there has been a tendency, and this is internationally, not just in Australia, for the formal part of the emergency management system to want to formalise spontaneous emergency volunteering and effectively bring it into the fold.
Mm-hmm.
A degree of that will happen for sure, but we will not coordinate it all away, that we won't be able to manage away the spontaneity part of spontaneous emergency volunteering. So a lot of the initiatives have been sort of about trying to control it, but we're now moving into a period where there's more of a spectrum. So I need to give a shout out to some of the local governments who've done some really great work on preparing and getting position descriptions for jobs that spontaneous volunteers could do, for example, in relation to relief centres and animal rescue and stuff. There's been a lot of community groups that have done some good stuff around that and have kind of led the way in thinking about management models or coordination, mobilisation models that work for spontaneous emergency volunteering groups like Blaze Aid, like Samaritan's Purse, like some of the animal rescue groups that are a bit more flexible in their volunteering, and they're not first responders, so they are what we would call second responders. So there's differences of context as you move away from an emergency event into sort of relief recovery of the context and the type of work that spontaneous volunteers can do. But the volunteering peaks, of course, there's been some volunteering peaks who've done some great work in finding ways to kind of bridge between that formal aspect and the more emergent, informal, organic response that comes from community. And EV Crew, which stands for Emergency Volunteering Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, from Volunteering Queensland. Yeah, so EV Crew or Emergency Volunteering Crew is a great example of that. And as I said, we did a case study on that system. It's modelled, so it's been something that's great about that is it's been used, so it's demonstrated, and so then others have looked at it and learnt from the experience Volunteering Queensland had with that system, because they used it on the ground, and so it was like demonstrated impact. And it's basically modelled on a temp agency type of model of finding accepting or buffering, I guess, for the helping organisations. Offers of assistance can be directed through to Volunteering Queensland, and they do a matching, sort of a live matching process of finding people who can fill roles for those organisations, as well as helping organisations understand what they need to do to be able to work with spontaneous emergency volunteers on the other side. So that's a great example.
Yeah, it's awesome. Goes both ways, and capacity builds on both sides.
That's right. Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious to know what messages that you'd like to particularly highlight for volunteer managers in their organisations who are looking to capitalise on spontaneous volunteer effort, because I really hope no one listening is thinking, oh my gosh, 60,000 volunteers, this is too hard. So I guess, if you could explain a few of those, that would be great.
Yes, yeah. So, that's a good point. I know organisations, and thinking about councils as well, that have had really large emergency events happen in their area that didn't have any planning and thinking in place for spontaneous volunteers, who were then had to deal with it on the fly as it happened in a big event. That is incredibly difficult to do. It's really hard for small organisations in particular to have the scope and the time, the capacity to do pre-planning for emergency events that may not happen to them, and most of the organisations that do have some pre-planning in place have had an experience with it and then realise, oh, we've got to do some planning for this. I think that's really important. Even if you don't think that directly coordinating spontaneous volunteers is right for your organisation, having some planning and thinking about it is really, really important. So the AIDA handbook has some great resources in it and questions to start helping volunteer managers and organisations think about what they might need to do. And that little table there is from the AIDA handbook, and you'll see there's two columns: minimum engagement and expanded engagement. So we break that apart on purpose, because if you're an organisation who's going to be active in a post-emergency context, and most community service organisations will be if something happens on their patch, because it will impact themselves and it will impact their beneficiaries, and they will probably get spontaneous offers of assistance.
Absolutely. Even if they don't think they play in that space,
that's right.
You know, it's just par for the course, you know, this particular moment.
So we suggested, first and foremost, communication. So if that happens and you're getting offers of assistance, what is your messaging going to be? So the other thing with spontaneous emergency volunteering is the motivation to do it is people perceive there is a need that is not being met. And that can come from media, it can come from social media, traditional media, it can come from their own feelings of they must be so overwhelmed, we've got to be able to do something to help. So there's a really important part to play in managing expectations of what is needed and what is not needed, and some really clear, consistent messaging around, and whether there are opportunities to help your organisation or not, and having some really clear messaging worked out beforehand will help your staff and your volunteers be able to kind of interact with people offering assistance. The other area we've got in there is collaboration, which is referring to being aware of, in your area, what's around with spontaneous emergency volunteering. Are there groups that are taking them? What's the messaging that other groups are using, of your volunteering peak is using, that emergency responders are using? What opportunities are there? And if there is any kind of meetings and working groups to think about spontaneous emergency volunteering in your local community or on your patch, to participate in that discussion so that you're aware of it and can kind of understand what's happening in your area locally.
Well, the worst thing would be to be suddenly directing a whole bunch of volunteer interest to another organisation and then turning around and saying, no way, Jose,
that's right,
we're not engaging.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that's really the main message behind collaboration.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
Much as anything else.
It's helping each other out and being aware of what good messaging. And some of the volunteering peaks have great messaging out and have done this fire season. They've been quite, I think the messaging's been really good. It's been really consistent. It's been quite clear. There's been messages about what is and isn't needed and when it's needed. So we know when the emergencies are out in the media, that's when the motivation to respond is quite strong, but the help that communities need can extend for a lot longer period after that. So there can be messaging around, we don't have anything for you now, but we would like to register you because in a few months we're going to need some help, and we might have time to train. So there's stuff around messaging that's really important to get straight.
And for anyone who is interested, the messaging that Volunteering Victoria sent out at the start of this season is available on our website. We'll pop a link up.
Yeah, that's right. And feeding off that like general messaging for an organisation to make sure that they're consistent with that, I think is really, really important. Yeah. So if you are considering whether actively managing spontaneous emergency volunteers is right for you, there's some questions to ask. I think the most important ones there are, is it right for the community that you're working in? Is it right for this kind of event? And is it right for your organisation? And there's some questions in there. Do we really have capacity to do this? Can the organisation make space for spontaneous emergency volunteers? And it is quite a big job. So just having some kind of realistic questions and answers about can we do this? Should we do this? Is there somebody else who can do it better than us, and could we support them instead? And also being aware that some of the spontaneous emergency volunteering will be self-organised. You may not directly manage spontaneous emergency volunteers, but they may be working around you, and that there can be quite a synergy develop between more formal response and some of the self-organised spontaneous emergency volunteering. The Student Volunteer Army in Christchurch is a good example of that. Once they got active, they met with the formal response coordinators and made an agreement of where the students would come to assist with cleanup, not in the high danger areas. And they effectively had like a map. So they had an agreement with the formal responders of where and how they would work so that they complemented each other's activities, and it was effective and efficient response, not overlapping, kind of getting in each other's way. So that kind of thing is really important.
Absolutely, makes total sense. You know, the message is talk to one another.
That's right, yeah. And there's some great questions and resources in that AIDA handbook to kind of steer you in the direction of asking and answering some of those questions for yourself and for your context and for your community.
Wonderful. So again, some of it has, I think, been highlighted in, what we've just been talking about, but do you have any limitations or risks to point out for volunteer managers to consider when thinking about trying to mobilise spontaneous emergency volunteer effort?
Yes, so I think as we've been told, it's easier to see the risks than to see the benefits.
Yeah.
In a meeting sitting in front of a bunch of people from emergency response agencies, they very openly said, well, if you just talk to us, you'll hear a lot about potential risks and not necessarily all the wealth of information about potential benefits, because they are risk managers. But they're definitely there. So of course there's things like you don't have background checks on these volunteers if they're not affiliated with you. Insurance issues always come up, so you need to be clear on those aspects, and there's some guidance in that direction in the AIDA handbook, but it varies place by place. Another one that comes up a lot that people need to be aware of is psychological support. So if you're not trained to work in emergency context and you are thrown into it, to be aware that of what kinds of roles spontaneous emergency volunteers are given that they're prepared for or not prepared for, and what kind of psychological support can be given to them. There is some research that has shown that where there has been like a spontaneous mobilisation, those people have actually been traumatised and needed services that were intended for people who are directly impacted by the emergency. So another risk is working at cross purposes with a formal response, so having that synergy and complementarity in effort and maintaining that is tricky and important, and really needs a lot of open communication. Yeah, I think that's probably enough to say on limits and risk. I don't want to put people off too much. I mean, logistics, of course, especially if people are coming from outside the area and you have huge numbers of people coming in and needing somewhere to stay or needing transport or needing to be fed, and the area that's impacted is already struggling to kind of get that together for the people who are local and have been impacted. So all of those things can be quite tricky to deal with, especially if it's larger scale. So
absolutely, key to be aware of. And yes, I don't mean to be a risk manager hat, but I think it is, we exist in such a risk adverse society that it's really good to like flesh out and think through some of these things before you engage further. So I guess we're nearing the end of our time with Blythe, and thank you. It's been such a interesting discussion from my end, but to leave it on, I guess a bit of a a nicer note, do you have any specific stories that you've encountered through your research? Because we all know that statistics can paint one picture and definitions and theoretical frameworks, but stories often are really, really impactful in understanding the benefits and the roles that spontaneous that anyone can play. So I wondered if you had any specific stories where spontaneous emergency volunteers have had a really great impact and filled gaps that traditional volunteering really couldn't.
Yes, and this comes, there's many I could choose from. There's one that I heard recently, not through my own research directly, but in Mallacoota, the fire recently coming through there majorly impacted. Ambulance Victoria made a little video about their volunteers' experiences of that fire in Mallacoota. And in discussing that, they talked about an experience that it's just small, it's just about one person, but I think it speaks really well to the synergy that can be there between formally trained volunteers and spontaneous volunteers. They talked about a local man who spent 48 hours refilling CFA trucks in town. So every time the trucks came in, he would refill the tanks for them because they had, and that gave them the opportunity to then go to the AMBOs to have the smoke washed out of their eyes. So they were really smoke impacted. So it gave them that little moment to go and get attended, their well-being to be attended to by the AMBOs because he took the time to fill trucks for them. So, and I think that just speaks to a little example of the synergy and how that different kinds of volunteering can support each other in that way. So he was a spontaneous volunteer from the local community that supported the CFA volley so that they could get a little bit of attention to their well-being during the fire. I think that's just shows what is possible when it all links together.
Absolutely, and I love that story because I think it highlights there are often so many aspects to emergency response and volunteering that you don't necessarily think about unless they're pointed out. You know, eye care and eye protection for CFA volunteers is not obviously the concern that's highlighted most, but obviously has a great impact on people's well-being, people's effectiveness, and so that engagement with an emergent volunteer, watch me use your preferred term, really a key difference. So right. We will wrap it up. We've got a few, Blythe has generously provided a very comprehensive list of resources and links, but if we could leave it, are you happy to share just some key takeaways that you want people who are listening to this webinar to really take back with them when thinking about practice at their organisation and reflecting on the really awful season that has been?
Yeah, I guess for me, a key takeaway that I like to try to emphasise all the time is that this is really normal. We talk about spontaneous emergency volunteering like it's something quite new because of social media. Social media is a part of it, but this is really normal human response to emergency that we are talking about that has these really deep therapeutic benefits. It is tricky as far as coordination and management goes, but the benefits are massive. And it's different in each context. So really asking those questions about how is this for us, for our community, keeping of course that the people who are being assisted, who've been impacted by an emergency are of primary focus. What does this do for them? What impact could it have for them? How does this fit for our organisation and for this event and for these volunteers, and I guess that, I think just keeping in mind that duty of care to the communities as well as to the volunteers and also to yourselves in the organisation, because I know when emergencies happen, the community sector organisations, like the workload and the pressure for people working in community sector can be massive as well. So it's also thinking about self-care as well in this, I think, is really important, and just stopping and taking a minute to think about some of those questions, I think, is really, really important.
Absolutely. Well, we cannot thank you enough for your time today, and really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, from various community organisations and that you've been involved with and research that you've been involved with as well. Blythe's contact details were on the front slide. So, if you have any follow-up questions, you can be in contact with Blythe personally or myself. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
My pleasure.